Okay, I think we're ready to go. Michael, thank you for your patience. He's online.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Michael Lynch. I teach philosophy at the University of Connecticut, and it's my great privilege to be the respondent and chair this panel over and under the hood. It's an emerging scholars panel, and we'll have two speakers today, and I'm going to introduce them separately before they speak. And then after they both have a chance to give their remarks, I'll say something, I promise, extremely brief, just a couple questions, and then we'll turn it over to discussion. And I'll moderate those Q&A, both the questions online and off. All right, so our first speaker today is Nicky Agate, who's currently Associate Dean for Academic Engagement at the Carnegie Mellon. She leads the library's faculty in ensuring their services meet and anticipate the research and learning needs of the campus community. And she co-leads a seminar for humanities faculty on global humanities and critical AI. She also serves as the on the MLA's Committee on Information Technology and has been a co-PI since 2016 on the Umetrics initiative, which researches the power of values-enacted interventions in academic decision-making and assessment practices. On top of that, Nicky holds a PhD in French literature from NYU and an MFA in literary translation from the University of Iowa, and has previously led digital humanities and communications teams at both Columbia and the University of Pennsylvania. Please join me in welcoming Nicky.
Hi, everyone. All right, I don't see my slides yet. Make the magic happen. Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's been absolutely incredible just learning from you all over the last 10 days. It's a little nerve-wracking to go this late on, actually, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to be talking to you about Poem, a values-enacted approach to improving meta-literacy. And when I say values-enacted, I mean that for me, I'm centering the values of community, collaboration, and openness in this project, and attempting to sort of check in with myself at every part along the way to make sure that I am actually living those values and not just saying they're my values, right? One caveat. This is a project I will hopefully be getting started on right when I get home. And I say hopefully because I will hear about whether or not it's been funded, hopefully by the end of July. If it hasn't been funded, I won't be able to pay the many, many people that I hope to be involved. And so I'm going to have to work out some way to hack it. But you know, I'm a strong believer in if you apply for funding for something, you should try and do it anyway and just like see how you can do it. So, and I think the funder's actually following along, so hi. All right. Okay. Poem is designed to be an iterative, community-reviewed and curated bilingual collection of over 600 flexible, open educational resources for use by high school and college instructors and librarians to improve student literacy in AI and algorithms, data and computation, and media and disinformation. So we have algorithmic and AI literacy, data and computational literacy, media and disinformation literacy. The idea is to provide access to teaching and learning materials that can help students gain the skills not only to understand the contemporary knowledge landscape, but to critically evaluate it, take control of their own engagement with it, and work within it as informed actors rather than passive consumers. So first of all, I want to check that everyone knows what an open educational resource is. No. Okay, good. I'm glad I put this slide in. All right, so they are resources, tools, and practices that are free of legal, financial, and technical barriers and can be fully used, shared, and adapted in the digital environment. So they're licensed for reuse and for attribution. And then we talk about the 5 R's of OERs. So there's reuse, the right to reuse the content in a wide range of ways. Revision, the right to adapt, adjust, modify, or alter the content. Remix, which is one of my favorites, which is the right to take some parts of it and add it with other parts of another one and then create something new. Redistribute, the right to share copies of the original content, your revisions or your remixes, and retain, the right to make, own, and control copies of the content. And so the OER movement has really sort of been taken up in libraries as a response to the sort of $200 charges for students to use an online textbook that they actually only get access to for, a semester or 2, and then they don't have it anymore. So it really is, this is sort of the bedrock of the openness in this project. All right. So as we've been talking about over the last 10 days or so, the widespread implementation of automated decision-making compounds existing social and financial inequities and exacerbates social divisions. So increasingly ubiquitous, intuitive, proprietary user interfaces obfuscate computational processes to present only auto-magical results. At the same time, we're barraged with the presentation of faster, cheaper, and easier to make falsified media content, misleading data visualizations, and selected biased data as truth. So as we move into sort of the second quarter of the 21st century, we're seeing people not only used by, but shaped by algorithms, right? They mediate and determine the type of information that people can see, the kinds of ideas that they interact with, and even the communities they belong to online. So when access to information is restricted not by paywalls, but by previous interactions and likes and purchases and browsing habits, when we're trained to favor the ease of the set menu over the adventure of the a la carte, we steadily lose agency over the inputs that shape our understanding of the world. And so in this increasingly complex environment, the importance of literacy, fluency, or competency has expanded from a focus on information literacy, which is defined as the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning, to now encompass a range of digital fluencies, particularly those pertaining to computation, data, and mis and disinformation. And over the course of the last 18 months, as we all know, that information ecosystem has been wholly disrupted by the mass availability of generative AI chatbots. And I think it's going to be potentially even more so by the potentially soon-to-be publicly available Sora AI. Right? This is the OpenAI's video generator, which promises to give ordinary people instant access to what the New York Times describes as the ability to create talking puppets, and The Guardian describes as mis or disinformation on steroids. Personally, I find it absolutely terrifying. As you may be aware, the US is in an election year, and we're not the only ones. Many countries have recently had presidential or parliamentary elections this year, most recently South Africa, Iran, the UK, France. Yay. Still to come, Algeria, Botswana, Ghana, Mauritius, Mozambique, Rwanda, Tunisia, Venezuela, and Uruguay. That's just some of the major elections happening this year. And you can imagine what this might do to those. And it's not just presidential politics, it's intersectional politics as well. As Noelle reminded us yesterday, there are thousands of women and girls who are survivors of image-based sexual abuse, superpowered by AI, and whose lives have been destroyed by so-called innovation. Back to the why. As communication scholar Michelle Amazine said of a 2024 report on media literacy education in the US, just when we need trusted information more than ever, our media ecosystem is poised for a tsunami of deliberately false content intended to mislead, supercharged by the use of generative artificial intelligence. Most, but not all people, we found, understand they need to have new skills to deal with it. So I think as we probably all realize in this room, AI is not exactly a future technology anymore. William Gibson once said, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And I've been thinking about that a lot. As early as 2017, right, there was a survey that said that there was a great need for education in algorithm literacy. One of the professors interviewed in that said, unless there is an increased effort to make true information literacy, meaning this broad literacy, a part of basic education, there'll be a class of people who can use algorithms and a class used by algorithms. Those used by suffer from many of the reasons that we've been talking about over the last 10 days, but also because the bias built into the algorithms themselves, what Arshin Adib Mukadam calls data polluted by a set of myths from the Enlightenment, is already built in. The gaps between those who can work with data and those who cannot, those who scrape, harvest, and otherwise collect data in the interest of capital, and those who simply and often unwittingly provide it, also makes data education a matter of survival. That was Evan Shapiro. He did a survey in 2023 on US attitudes towards data collection and usage, and he found, so there were 45,000 US adults surveyed in there. He found that more than 2/3 of them had no idea how their data were being used. So for him, being literate about how your data is gathered, used, and abused is absolutely crucial. Catherine D'Ignacio, the author of Data Feminism, agrees, right? She equates data literacy not just with survival, but after Paulo Freire, with emancipation. Literacy involves not just the acquisition of technical skills, but also the emancipation achieved through the literacy process. And nowhere does this emancipation seem so urgent than in the realm of critical media and disinformation literacy, with its close ties to AI. Again, disinformation isn't new. Those of us that visited the Hector Peterson Museum at the weekend saw harrowing examples of it in the reporting of the events of June 16th, 1976. So just imagine for a second how that event might have been reported under an oppressive regime with access to artificial intelligence technologies. So despite what I've tried to describe as an urgency, school librarians, who are often the people equipped, trained, and expected to teach meta-literacies in the high school classroom and on college campuses, are increasingly deemed an unaffordable luxury in the US in cash-strapped public education systems. And just because I think some of you might be thinking, hey, wait, librarians? Librarians do more than books? They actually get, what are you talking about? So we do a lot of literacy and meta-literacy education. Data literacy, spatial data literacy, open literacy. We have a whole information literacy framework that is built by the Association of College and Research Librarians that guides a lot of the work that we do. And these first 4 points, these are 7 frames in the framework. And the first 4, I think, are particularly relevant if we think about teaching something like AI literacy to students. Right? So authority is constructed and contextual. You can imagine exploring the construction of AI-generated content, exploring the importance of understanding the context in which AI systems are developed and used, or encouraging students to critically evaluate AI-generated information, considering factors such as authorship, credibility, and potential biases, right? And that's just one. Okay, so back to librarians being a luxury. According to a 2021 national report, almost 3.1 million students in predominantly Hispanic districts in the US and almost 4.8 million students in predominantly non-white districts did not have a school librarian. The numbers dipped by about 5% during the pandemic, and they just haven't picked up again. And then classroom teachers, for their part, have reported feeling unequipped, undertrained, or otherwise unable to create lessons in this rapidly evolving space of media and disinformation, data and computation, and AI. And then even in universities, librarians don't normally teach classes for credit, right? So we end up with these one-shot workshops where we get 10 minutes of an English class to try and teach, I don't know, information literacy, or we end up hosting workshops where, you know, the students are opting in and you're actually sort of preaching to the choir. And the one other thing I would add is that while there are open educational resources or educational resources available in the US on these topics, they're almost exclusively Anglophone, and they're often not licensed for remixing or reuse. So teachers can't take them and adjust them and, you know, help their students see themselves in the examples that are being used. So poem, I put the slide up too early. Poem is an intervention. It's a robust platform that supports the development of critical skills in algorithmic thinking, data analysis, media literacy, and digital citizenship, right? Helping people to understand how these algorithms are produced, deployed, and used in everyday life. Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about the platform. So, the collection's, like I said, divided into these 3 literacies. And then there are going to be 2 librarians that are sort of charged with being co-editors of each of the literacies. One will be one of my colleagues from CMU, who are all PhD holders in things like education and media literacy and things like that. And the other are going to be the result of an open call that we'll put out for high school and community college librarians who might be interested in co-editing. They're going to write introductory areas for or introductory essays for the literacy area for which they're responsible. And then what they're going to do is organize that literacy area into about 10 keywords, right? So, and these will be evolving, we'll get back to it. And this sort of structure of area keywords is inspired by a project that was published by the Modern Language Association a few years ago called Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities. So if you're interested in sort of looking at a precursor to this, that's where to go. So, like I said, each of those keywords is going to then have a curator. This gets complicated. And each of those curators is going to be responsible for going out and finding 10-ish in the first edition, teaching and learning objects that relate to that keyword, right? They're going to have to ensure that those objects represent a diverse range of perspectives and learning modalities and methods. They're going to tag them with the appropriate audience and educational level, and then they're going to shepherd them through community review. So, I want to talk a little bit about the proposed possible potential content process. Like I said, this is going to be sort of iterative and reflective, and it is going to be in sort of to honor that community value, community-led. And I will say that when I say community, I'm talking about the librarians, teachers, and students who would be working on this, right? I just think it's important sometimes to define your community. And so, you know, a lot of this could change, right? So this is just how we're envisaging it for right now. All those folks are going to have intentional opportunities to engage with and shape the design of the web interface, the creation of and tagging and filtering systems, and then UX and UI elements, as well as the content themselves. And so obviously this is sort of premised on the principles of design justice. That's principle 4 there. But I had a conversation with Wes earlier about how they weren't ever really meant for academia. And so I'm trying to sort of back away from that a little bit because this is a pretty academic project. So you can see here, there are these little speechy bubbles are where there are sort of wider opportunities for review. You're going to have the call here. For the co-editors, and then the co-editors and the web team will sit down and have a conversation about what the values are that they want to guide their work together and what that's going to look like in the work they do together. Then they're going to draft keywords. Those will get put out for review, finalized and translated, call for keyword curators, right? Then there's going to be another sort of, we're going to sit down and say, okay, as a whole team, let's think about the values and principles that apply to us, and then what our learning objectives are going to be moving forward. There are a couple of, in the grant, I've written in a couple of sort of opportunities to engage with accessibility consultants, just to make sure that the whole project is accessible. Throughout here, I just didn't have enough space for it. There are CMU student translators who will be paid, who are translating everything English and Spanish. And then we move on. So you see, there's an ongoing sort of process here with a lot of back and forth, community review. And then while the first edition is being put together, this second edition, just because the space is moving so fast, right, new keywords are going to be added. That's going to be going on. I'm showing you the sort of possible editorial and curatorial team journey here, but there's a web development one that matches it. with multiple times set aside for sort of co-design and ideation and wireframing and review with stakeholder groups, but I just don't think I have time to share that here. Because the process is iterative and reflexive, it may and probably will change. And the keywords that the curators or the co-editors come up with may not be the ones that we end up actually using, right? When the curators come in, they might say, you know, this term is actually more relevant to the kinds of people we're trying to address with this, and so we have to just be open for those kinds of, and flexible for those kinds of changes. All right, so here's an example of potential keywords that might be chosen by the AI literacy co-editors, right? And don't at me, these are just placeholders, so. And so each of these keywords would have a curator chosen from an open call, right? And that call is going to go to, you know, community, college, public, high school librarians and teachers, as well as, you know, shared widely on listservs. We want to get as many perspectives and voices and examples in this project. And the centrality of that type of inclusive approach is necessary to ensure that that target audience of high school and community and college librarians and educators see themselves and their student populations not only in the exercises and examples, but in the roster of authors and editors who've shaped the work. So they're not just users, they're contributors. Okay, so 10 potential keywords here. If we take one of them, and just because we've been talking about it a lot this week, data sovereignty. We can imagine a set of potential teaching and learning objects, right? These might have already been created, and they may exist on the web. Alia's project is one excellent example. I really hope we can include that. It's openly licensed. Or they might exist on someone's hard drive or syllabus, or they might not exist yet, right? But it's sort of, in bringing them together, it's this sort of like curatorial move that I think Poem is going to be the most helpful. So here, potential project, and say we said, okay, one of the objects of that could be, oh no, we haven't even gone there yet. This is what a keyword landing page would look like. Okay, so the keyword is data sovereignty. This might be a landing page. I didn't even bother trying to do the text. On the right-hand side, you would see the various learning objects, and you're like, okay, I can learn about indigenous data sovereignty. There's a video there. There's a paper on indigenous protocol and AI, and there's the Maori, and I know I'm butchering it, Kate, data governance work. And so say I clicked on that, then I would get brought to this tagged resource, right, where I can link out to the resource, I can read a brief description of it, I can click to get it translated into Spanish, and it's tagged with the type of thing it is, how long it might take to use, the learning objective, and the audience, so higher education. Okay, so because Poem's going to have bilingual content and a bilingual interface, it's going to be accessible to the almost 42 million Spanish speakers in the US, who make up over 61% of the speakers of languages other than English in American homes. So that's why I chose Spanish as the other language. But because of its status as an open educational resource with those 5 Rs, it can be translated and adapted into other languages and cultures. It can be enriched with other examples, enhanced and updated through integration with other open materials. So I hope that you all here might find it interesting and might consider being a topic editor, contributing or recommending your best meta-literacy materials. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Nikki. That was great. And I have a bunch of things that I myself want to talk to you about. But first, we're going to hear from our second panelist, who is Will Orr. And Will is a PhD candidate in communication at the University of Southern California. He's also a member of the Justice and Technoscience, or Just Tech Lab at ANU's School of Regulation and Global Governance, and the Knowing Machines project that traces the histories, practices, and policies, the politics, of how machine learning systems are trained to interpret the world. So I'm going to hand it over to Will. Please join me in welcoming him to the panel.
All right, hey everyone. Thank you so much for having me today to present my paper tentatively titled The Multiplicity of Data Quality. Yeah, just echoing Nicky's comment earlier, it's been such an honor to be, spend the last week with you all, and I really appreciate this generative atmosphere. So yeah, I'm very grateful to be here. I'm a PhD student in communication at the University of Southern California, and broadly my research investigates how AI practitioners navigate the socio-technical challenges of their work, and particularly I focus on the social work of how datasets for AI systems are built and maintained. But to begin with, I want to share a quote from one of the dataset creators that I've recently interviewed. He explained to me that web crawling itself might not be the difficult thing. The difficult thing is to keep the quality at a certain high level. But this gets me thinking, what exactly constitutes a high quality dataset? And how can we measure or understand a dataset's quality? So data quality is a key standard that shapes how training datasets are created and the politics embedded within them. So as the adage of statistics goes, garbage in, garbage out, right? And in AI research, this underscores a crucial reality. The quality of the data used to train a model directly impacts the quality of automated results. And as Harry illustrated in his presentation yesterday, training datasets are the essential building blocks of AI systems. They establish the epistemic boundaries of how AI systems understand and interpret the world. And when these machine learning systems fail, we can look towards the politics embedded in training datasets and their representations of the world to understand why that might be the case. But the problem is contemporary training datasets are of such an immense scale that it's impossible to know entirely what's contained within them or audit them via any manual or qualitative means. At the same time, we should not understand these datasets as simply a collection of the entire internet. Datasets are not self-evident, right? But they're products of social, technical, and organizational dynamics present at their creation. So in my work, I analyze these datasets not as ready-made or high quality in the world, but rather I use these qualitative methods as an entry point to understand datasets in the making as unstable and contingent artifacts. But achieving data quality is far from straightforward or homogeneous. Technical literature on data quality often underscores its intrinsic properties of data that can be measured or tracked and evaluated. And this includes accuracy, timeliness, consistency, completeness, and representativeness, among others. So these have all become technical benchmarks to be calculated and evaluated by dataset users and creators. So for example, here we have a framing within the ISO, the International Standards Organization on data quality, which defines it quite vaguely as the degree to which a set of inherent characteristics of an object fulfills requirements, whatever that means. So other conceptions of data quality underscore it not as a monolithic standard, but as a contextual and nuanced concept that varies significantly across domains, context, and users' needs and data formats. And this framing of data quality refers to the data that are fit for use or data that possesses desired features by the users. So this also points towards how specific data types and formats and storage capacities, I guess, have specific requirements in order to be seen as valid or high quality data. So high quality data here is informed by the material forms of the data itself and the imposed technical standards that it must adhere to. So understanding data quality as contextual foregrounds not only the technical requirements of this data, but also the specific expectations of its users. But we also see how data quality operates within this larger socio-technical imaginary of the potential of data-driven systems as well as their potentials for failures, such as harmful outputs, inequality, privacy violations, and misinformation. So technical literature on data quality thinks of data quality operates as safeguarding the value of data as a resource to be harnessed. And this sits within the larger capitalist imperative of extracting value from data for superior performance, reliability, or applicability of machine learning systems. Yet data quality is also this boundary concept to explain the utility and suitability of data sources for users, regulators, and community members. And we can see here on the right how the recent EU AI Act explicitly ties high quality data with anti-discrimination, safety, and compliance. So through this lens, I want to think about data quality not just as technical standards or improving efficiency, but it's also a reflection of broader social values and aspirations, shaping and being shaped by the evolving narrative of what is desirable and attainable in the realm of data-driven innovation. So I present these multiple definitions of data quality to highlight that data quality is no one single thing. Rather, I look towards Anne-Marie Moll's notion of multiplicity to understand data quality as emerging through multiple perspectives and practices, each creating a different version of what quality might mean. So in this project, I therefore ask, how do dataset creators conceptualize, measure, and maintain the quality of their creations? And theoretically, my research is firmly rooted in STS traditions of laboratory studies that seeks to understand the intricate processes through which knowledge is produced, condensed, and solidified within scientific practices. And moreover, STS scholars have underscored the importance of studying these boring things, in the words of Susan Lissar, that structure our world. So this includes the standards that make our world work and that are often invisibilized through repetition, naturalization, and omission. So while data quality operates as a standard itself, STS also draws attention to the ways in which standards do not operate in isolation, but are rather nested and upheld by other standards and infrastructures. That's what I hope to draw out today. So to conduct this research, I selected Common Crawl as a site for this study, specifically which focuses on the collection of data for contemporary AI models. So Common Crawl is a 501c3 nonprofit organization in the US, established in 2007. They utilize a web crawler to compile text data of over 4 billion publicly available web pages each month, and this equates to releasing approximately 300 terabytes of text every month. Common Crawl was established with the mission of providing researchers and academics with high quality data that was previously only available to large search engine corporations. So in this sense, Common Crawl resonates with the aspirations of creating a data commons that we've heard about previously. And today, Common Crawl is particularly essential in the era of large generative models, as its dataset has been taken up by technology corporations and academics and non-profit organizations as the foundation of their training datasets. So for instance, GPT-3 utilizes 41 months of content from Common Crawl as training data, which accounts to approximately 82% of all the raw tokens within it. So yeah, this is a bit of a crude diagram of the pipeline of creating a large language model like ChatGPT. Common Crawl sits at the very beginning as like in the data collection phase. And so basically this establishes the parameters of possibility for training data sets within the machine learning pipeline. So that is to say that any data or perspective or voices that are excluded from this step will not be included downstream without intentional and manual intervention. So despite the prevalence of Common Crawl, audits of the dataset reveal some pretty questionable content, which may be of no surprise to anyone here. This includes toxic content such as sexual abuse, hate speech, white supremacist materials, anti-trans content, as well as low-effort content such as boilerplate or machine-translated text. The dataset, of course, overrepresents perspectives of younger English-speaking people from the global north. So given these flaws, how then do creators measure and claim the quality of this collection? So to answer this question, I have conducted 6 interviews with Common Crawl employees between 2022 and 2024. Common Crawl throughout this period underwent some immense transformations. So when I first spoke to them, they had a single employee that had been operating for years. And then the following year, they had 3 employees, and then quite recently, now they have 14 employees. So primarily, I've interviewed crawl engineers and technology officers that have had first-hand experiences conducting these crawls and determining its quality. And I've supplemented these interviews by analyzing internal documents, such as presentations that were given or blog posts, as well as the Common Crawl forum, which has over 1,800 members, most of which are users from the dataset, and has over 1,100 common threads dating back to 2011. Okay, so to begin with, the quality of the dataset is understood through both the real and imagined use cases of the dataset. So what I mean by this is engineers look to research papers for evidence of how the dataset is used and user interactions on the forum for how it could be improved. What makes Common Crawl a challenging case, however, is that the user community is far from homogeneous. Generative AI systems is one recent, albeit very important, use case of the dataset. And each of these imagined cases informs how engineers approach the perceived quality of the dataset. So for instance, creators note that the crawl may have value of all kinds, may value all kinds of content in there, including hate speech or otherwise undesirable content, due to the potential future use cases of identifying discriminatory content, for instance, of web security, or potentially training a filtering algorithm. So while the quality of the dataset is deeply intertwined with the diverse needs and expectations of its users, without a clear use case, creators must remain open to all possible uses of the dataset. So thus, the notion of data quality becomes detached from the notion of context, as creators strive for quality without knowledge of how it might be implemented. So in the absence of a unified context or use case, engineers turn to intrinsic measures to understand quality. And this particularly takes the form of quantitative measures. So firstly, engineers contend that Common Crawl is representative of the web. It's a high-quality data set in the sense that it's one that adequately captures the diversity of content present online. And while users may request to increase crawling certain websites or contexts, creators note that the dataset does not attempt to be a complete collection of the web, but rather representative, as we can see in the interaction in the top here. So representativeness here is achieved through quantitative metrics. Common Crawl samples websites from a URL list based on a web graph algorithm called harmonic centrality. And this algorithm ranks all domains based on how many other domains are linked to them, as well as how central they are to the rest of the graph. Quite similar to Google's PageRank, if anyone's familiar with that. So these rankings are then taken as an indication of the quality of the site itself. As one crawl engineer explained to me here, we just take the rankings and expect that they are true. I mean, low quality content has a lower ranking. So in the absence of any qualitative measure of quality, these rankings are taken as a reliable measure of the quality of the content's presence on those pages. The assumption here is that crawling pages with higher ranked links more frequently and in more depth will lead to a more representative sample of the web, and thus higher quality. So this view of quality as an aggregation of measurable characteristics is underpinned by what Ted Porter refers to as a quantitative mentality that has created a reliance on numbers and metrics in order to understand the social world and inform decision-making practices. Quality becomes knowable not by inspecting the data itself, but rather sensing it through linked graphs and rankings. But this framing of representativeness also begs the question, what does representative even mean? And in which dimensions is representativeness strived for? So particularly here, engineers noted that the crawl underrepresents non-English languages, and by constructing their URL list by following links on sites that are present within the crawl, the algorithm systematically downgrades any pages in languages that are other than English. So these pages are linked less frequently from their sites that are existing in the URL crawl and are thus deemed to be of lower quality. So here we see how a reliance on quantitative constructions of data quality can reinforce hegemonic power dynamics of the web that privilege certain voices and perspectives while marginalizing others. This approach perpetuates a cycle where popular, often English language and mainstream sites are given precedence, reinforcing their visibility and influence. Meanwhile, less mainstream, non-English or minority-focused sites are systematically downgraded and overlooked. And this not only skews the representation of information on the web, but also exacerbates existing inequalities, as important but less linked sites become less accessible and less influential in the broader digital discourse. So at the same time, ensuring high quality is also dependent on enacted expertise of these crawl engineers themselves. And I want to illustrate this through an example of how engineers define and identify what is called as spam content. So engineers that I spoke to refer to spam not as the quality of the content itself, such as low effort, phishing or scam emails that we might be familiar with, but instead spam is a cluster of interconnected link bubbles that can break the crawling infrastructure itself. So moments of breakdown here are thus used as indicators that the data quality has been compromised. Crawl engineers thus enact embodied knowledge of their tools to protect them in the name of quality. And they do this by looking at the link patterns and manually excluding some certain links from the URL list. So here we see how infrastructures and their fragility shape the standards that come to define what data quality means. So finally, we also see data creators recognize the limitations of a purely technical approach to ensuring data quality. And this is particularly in the, ensuring the representation of non-English languages. So this requires manual intervention to adjust the scores of pages of particularly low resource languages so that they become crawled more frequently. At the same time, crawl engineers are limited by the tools at their disposal, right? They often report having to rely on these clunky language detectors that are unable to, that have a difficulty properly detecting low in resource languages. And so here we see how disparities compound through technological infrastructures to ultimately reinforce the marginalization of low resource languages in web data collection. So these cases underscore that crawl engineers are active participants in the creation of data quality. In this way, they are reminiscent to me of the 20th century scientists that create representative accounts of nature within scientific atlases that are discussed by Daston and Galliston. These are people who employ the epistemic virtue of trained judgment to mediate their own scientific observations in constructing an objective account of nature. So here we see how a supposedly representative account of the world are intertwined with the subjectivities that produce them. So the quality of the crawl is also asserted as procedural. So it's by virtue of the processes that are followed and the standards that are adhered to. And this was particularly prevalent through the discussions of adhering to social norms, for instance, such as consent to collect data from the web. So for one example, after I expressed my interest in understanding data scraping, one of the engineers quickly objected and he said, "We prefer the term crawl to scrape. We make sure to announce ourselves before we collect anything. We respect robots.txt, which I'll get to. And web scrapers don't announce themselves, they just collect." So here, the particular value of Common Crawl is seen through its adherence to existing standards that are used as an indicator of consent for web content owners to be included within their data set. So robots.txt, as an example on the left here, is a file that is used as an agreement between website owners and crawl operators to define how a website should be crawled. It represents a series of instructions that details which specific web crawlers, such as search bots, can access pages with instructions of how the site should be accessed or which pages should not be processed. However, an adherence to robots.txt is not legally binding, and it's rather a voluntary standard that was developed by consensus on an email listserv back in June of 1994. So Common Crawl refers to itself as a polite crawler as they delay their requests and they announce themselves, and crucially they take robots.txt seriously to avoid scraping potentially private or sensitive information. So this was seen as a major distinguishing factor for the Common Crawl team from other data sets who may not be as respectful as respecting the wishes of web operators. At the same time, the creators acknowledge that there are flaws of relying on an existing standard for a proxy for consent. So importantly, when crawling the web, Common Crawl bot not only queries the robots.txt file at the time of its collection. It does not retroactively check the website owners have opted out from the crawl. And this is significant due to the longevity of the crawl itself, right, dating back to 2008, long before this contemporary AI moment and long before current literacy regarding web scraping. So every crawl engineer that I spoke to also pointed out that Common Crawl itself would remove content from the crawl upon the request of data subjects. However, with follow-up questions, this seemed easier said than done. One crawl engineer explained that the challenge here is that the technical formats that Common Crawl uses to release data are intended for archival purposes only. They're not intended to be changed after their creation. And this is due to a structural index that holds all the data together, as well as strict integrity checks that are embedded within the format. And so this means that while it's not impossible to remove data after it's been collected, it poses a great technical challenge, turning the data into, as they say, Swiss cheese over time. So here we see how social norms are in friction with the technical integrity of the data as a whole. Moreover, the limitations of the standards to adequately capture the consent of contemporary data subjects begs the question whether such a standard for web crawling, which is often used for applications such as web search, can adequately capture the consent for use in training data sets that will be reproduced by generative AI outputs in perpetuity. Connecting back to the Fry's model of consent that Sasha presented last week, this creep of the parameters of consent may violate these ideals that consent is both informed and specific. And these deficiencies of existing consent standards have prompted the development of new standards that specifically signal willingness to be included in AI training data sets. And this is one example, AI.text, that's been developed by the artist collective Spawning. However, as these standards are new, they have not been adequately standardized across the community. One crawl engineer explained that in order to properly survey these desires, Common Crawl must look in at least 5 different places, most of which are not currently captured by the crawl. So we see how the evolving standards highlight the ongoing challenges of balancing technical integrity and social standards in the pursuit of data quality. So I just want to connect this work back to our broader discussion of design justice over the last few weeks. I guess firstly, one takeaway is by viewing data quality as a multiplicity, we see that how we define data quality and who gets to define it and how it is measured drastically shapes these foundations of AI systems. So this case highlights how a reliance on quantitative metrics in the name of quality to uphold, works to uphold dominant ideologies and suppress and marginalize cultures and languages from prominent AI datasets. We can see how quality here can be strategically deployed to justify logics of extraction and conformity that work to uphold existing power dynamics and systems of domination. So furthermore, we also see how the importance of proactive involvement of marginalized groups in data set creation. It's not just about who is included, but how. So that is who gets to define what high quality data set looks like and actually undertake this work of data quality. We also see that the existing infrastructures throughout this story highlight that without proactive involvement of community groups in data set creation, AI systems will continue to perpetuate existing inequalities and power dynamics. Further, we need to take the materialities of data systems that we rely upon seriously and consider new formats for consent protocols that promote and protect user autonomy and agency. And finally, this case once again highlights the dangers of supposed general purpose artifacts without clearly defined and communicated use cases. So data quality without context might not be quality at all. And relying on intrinsic properties alone risks distributing data that is fit for no one. So we see these same problems across these massive AI scraped training data sets that Abiba Burhan spoke about recently that prioritize scale over any notion of suitability. So reflecting on this socio-technical imaginary of data quality presented earlier, through this case, I'm reminded of Ruha Benjamin's argument that one's person imagined future can be another person's living nightmare. So in this case, high quality data is not quality for everyone. Yeah, that's my presentation. I hope that this can maybe serve as a reflection on the kind of qualities that we kind of want to see in data sets moving forward. Thank you. Yeah, looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Will. So I realize I can hear myself echoing. I hope that people can hear me. I wanted to thank both Nicky and Will for such excellent presentations. And one thing that I just wanted to say really was a thought that occurred as both of you were speaking, which is that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, philosopher and friend Richard Rorty used to say that epistemology was dead. And that was a sentiment that in my field, philosophy, and a lot of other fields, was widely shared at the time. One of the things that your presentations, I think, illustrate is that in our current moment, not only is epistemology, that is the study of how we know in a social context in particular, not only is that not dead, it's actually something that we all urgently need to pursue, that in a way, what both of you sort of are showing, at least to me, or suggesting to me, is that we all need to be epistemologists now. That is, we all need to be paying attention to how knowledge is being shaped. One of the things that Will noted was in his sum up is the truth that data materialities produce politics, shape politics. And they also, at the same time, obviously are shaping knowledge, or what we perceive to be knowledge. So there's a few different ways, I think, that both of these presentations interact. And I'll be interested to hear very quickly. We're going to move to questions and answers, but I just wanted to talk, first highlight how both of you were bringing out in different ways and at different points how structural systems of power are shaping both how we are teaching literacy and how we know to, with the internet and with AI, to students. And also how we're actually even structuring our AI platforms. That is, in particular, the use of English as the dominant, both input and output in this overall mechanism of knowledge is really reproducing structural systems of injustice and power. And so one thing that I might ask you both is to talk a little bit about that and perhaps see how both projects, it would be interesting to hear from both of you about how you see the other person's project as perhaps on this point intersecting with your own. So I'll start with that. I hope that was clear enough of a question, and throw it open to Nicky and Will to see if they want to address that.
So the issue of English as a reproducer of structural systems of injustice has been very much part of the conversation over the last 10 days. And you know, we've veered from, if data sets are available in other, or made available in other languages, does that just enable the gobbling up of them by, you know, the big AI companies in a way that almost works against the stated goal of keeping those languages alive? Or, you know, do we need to make sure that more things are in here to burn it all down? If I think about how our projects intersect, I think it is maybe just at that moment of trying to sort of state the obvious that is not always seen as obvious, I think particularly for people in the US, in that what your Google search results, what your AI chatbot queries, etc., are spitting back out at you, and honestly, often what you're reading in your scholarly journals is the result of a dominance of Anglophone and English language sort of structure, so that the people that produce, the people that publish knowledge in ways that are well supported enough to circulate often are doing so in English. And I think there's a tendency not to think beyond that and wonder, not the people in this room, and question how much of the story you're actually getting, right? And so I would say that that's something I'm seeing in both of our projects, but especially in yours.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that, those comments and that question, Michael. Yeah, totally. I just want to echo what Nicky said. I think both of our projects are definitely trying to, I guess, uncover the hidden work that's kind of behind these systems, as well as as you're suggesting, these structural power and these systems of domination, perhaps. I think in my work, yeah, as I was saying, like English obviously presents as a dominating framework through crawled data sets. We see how the URL list that is created that dictates which sites will be crawled at all. Yeah, that's created by following links that are on existing English sites, right? So this list will only ever which has a much less likelihood of producing sites that are not in the English language. But I think another point that you're talking about these structures of power made me thinking about capitalism itself, right? This system that it's kind of operating within. I kind of alluded to briefly, but this is basically a non-profit organization who are collecting data, and this data set itself is it's the largest data set that's available of its kind, and then it's holding this really prominent position within big tech companies as a training data set. I think now perhaps they're starting to use their own crawls, but for such a long time this has been the the foundation of so many of these models. So it begs the question of how much of this non-profit work and labor then is kind of hoovered up itself and exploited, I guess, by these structures of capital. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think I would just add, I have seen some examples of crawling in other languages for sort of good purposes. I'm thinking of the project Sucho. I don't know if how many of you know that, but it was an effort when the war in the Ukraine started for that a lot of librarians began doing huge web crawls of cultural heritage sites in Ukraine to try and preserve that, because they were not being automatically crawled, even by things like Internet Archive or whatever, to try and preserve those and keep those alive even as the sort of physical infrastructure fell. So.
Yeah, I should just say, like, I'm not against crawling in itself in any way, right? I think that as we say, like, Google search, for instance, Google search, for instance, relies on having a crawl of the internet in order to kind of understand what's there in the first place. I think that just the ways in which this, the ways in which notions of quality then become, I guess, co-opted and then used as training data sets, I think that is really what poses a concern here. As Nicky's pointing towards, that crawling can be a very useful tool in many research purposes. Yeah, thanks.
That's great. Thanks, guys. So Nicky, I had a particular question for you, and I just wanted to follow up on. First of all, I love this project. I really think it needs to be funded. It is an intervention in my mind to precisely the right point, which is librarians, which we crucially need at this moment particularly in the U.S. But that's actually one of the questions I have for you. I mean, to what extent are you, as you know much better than I, libraries themselves have become a political hotspot in the culture wars of the U.S. With the far right in particular targeting libraries as sources for corrupting the youth, as they might think about it, but sources of information and knowledge. That's in some circles are no longer taken for granted as good things. So to what extent do you think that's going to be an issue, those sort of attacks are going to be an issue that you're going to have to navigate while implementing this project when it is funded, and I'm sure it will be?
Oof, I hadn't thought about that. I was living in my bubble. Okay. So I guess my hope would be that because we're trying to be really, really intentional about including as many voices and representatives of as many populations as possible in this project, that we would be getting topic editors and keyword curators who are maybe in some of those states where pointing to even certain kinds of resources might be seen to be, somehow defying state law because, I don't know, there's a queer person in it or something like that. So I think if we try and be as inclusive as possible while ensuring that there are materials that people, if their names are associated with them, if they're employed by public institutions, things like that, can feel comfortable pointing to. That will be helpful. I think the other sort of safeguard we have in place here is this really extensive community review, where we have, you know, a team of 6 plus 10 plus, I don't even know how many people that is. A lot of people, all who will all be sort of peer reviewing and community reviewing each other's work, and that I think, in the spirit of openness, we'll be able to sort of produce this. My one fear from what you just said actually is protecting people who may be authors or contributors and who might get pushback. And so I think that's making me think about, you know, providing options for anonymous contributions, even if they're still, you know, you still get recompense, but you don't actually have your name on that if that's what you need. So that's actually really helpful. Thank you.
Great. And Will, I have a question for you, and then I thought we'd throw it open to Q&A, both online and off. So Will, to what extent do you, with your work on Common Crawl and the quality of data, do you see the sort of poison well problem emerging? That's what some people call the issue with the fact that, as you noted, there's a lot of junk in Common Crawl's data and any data that is produced from the internet, because the internet contains a huge amount of bad stuff. To the extent to which a lot of us, including myself, have been writing about the problem that, to the extent to which a lot of data that is appearing on the internet now is AI generated. We don't know how much, obviously, but you know, the speculation ranges wildly. And that AI data, generated data, is going to itself be product, in some cases, of hallucination, bias, prejudice, and have been trained on stuff that contains a lot of junk. That the well from which Common Crawl is drawing is becoming increasingly poisoned by the products of that are being trained on Crawl's data. So the idea that there is a sort of loop, right, where the well is being poisoned in a sense by itself, the well of data, and so that we're going to see some people claim that it's, I've heard arguments you know, from you know, that it's inevitable to see a decline of data, that the rate of that decline, depending on how you factor the model, is going to always be faster than we can actually correct for problems in the data. Now, that's controversial. I'm not sure it's correct, but I'd be interested to know what you think of that problem and whether you see it in the research that you're doing.
That's such a great question. I was wondering the same thing when I was talking to them. Yeah, I think it, you know, you're right. It's obviously a huge problem, and increasingly so. You know, these people that kind of work on what constitutes a collection of the internet, you know, are seeing such an increase of generative content. So that's definitely a thing. I think that what they're attempting to do is to label this content as generated, which, you know, as itself is a, you know, huge challenge that no one's really overcome yet. But the other thing that, you know, one of the crawl engineers pointed towards was maybe there'll be a point in which you know, we'll all just be relying on the crawl, you know, before, say, like December 2022. That'll be like the point of, like, that's when things went to hell. And so so I think that, yeah, kind of understanding, I think, Common Crawl not as just like a single data set, but as a temporal artifact is really important here. You know, this, you know, how we understand quality and the contents of it has changed drastically over time. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So I think it's time for us to turn it over to Q&A. And one thing for us to briefly discuss, we already have a question questions from people online who've raised their hand, but I thought we could alternate between taking questions online and offline, that is in the room. And I think Nicky and Will, I'm going to need some help for although I can see the room, I can't see everyone. So, and it's going to be difficult for me to, as it were, point to people. So Will and Nicky, I think I might ask you to yourselves sort of pick questions from those of you in the room, if that makes sense, or suggest some other method, and I can call on the people online. So let's start with somebody in the room, if there are questions in the room. If not, I'll move to people online. Okay, so
where do we want to start? I see John. Do you want to start?
Michael, can you hear me?
Sure. The question I had that I put in the chat was about know your customer laws, because these laws protect consumers. I'm in the United States of America jurisdiction right now, and know your customer laws related to cryptocurrency and blockchain systems prevent a lot of fraud. Because know your customer laws let the police, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, whatever the equivalents are in jurisdictions in Europe and Africa and the United States and North America, know your customer laws force you to show your identification. It's backed by a fiduciary, say like the Federal Reserve Bank or the government. And those KYC laws help trust that transactions that occur on a ledger are, say, like backed by some government that has a right that's usually termed like eminent domain in real estate. So that's the connection to fraud and the connection to essentially like what you're saying about the nonprofit and like annotations and people getting remunerated and compensated. It's all great, but my family's in Estonia, half of my family's in China, and then whenever I go there, I need like a burner phone, all my money on Bitcoin. I see civilian soldiers in both places around, and I cannot keep my family's assets in Estonia, and I cannot keep my family's assets in China. So if you're going to be paying people in those jurisdictions, then what are the laws to protect against fraud? And this comes from like my background in healthcare, because I do a lot of like peer-based therapy, and then trust is the hardest part. Because if you're trusting somebody to sell behavior change to somebody who doesn't want it, then you need to be compensated as a therapist. And then if you're really good at that, that leads to like cult-like behavior, or we've all heard too many stories about guru-type behavior. So how you prevent that is by understanding the laws and then working with the local governance structures, whether they have eminent domain, like in the United Kingdom, which owns 1/6 of the world's landmass, then they lease land with 50-year-long time horizons to people in London.
Okay,
so when I lived in London, my friends
so
would buy
much for
houses
that.
for 50 years. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, did we have a question in the room? Okay.
Michael, I just want to make sure that you understand that we have found it helpful to ask multiple questions at one time. So what we're going to do is, in addition to that online question, we're now going to take 2 from the room, and then the presenters will answer, and then we have at least 2 more in the room. So first we're going to go to Rogelio and then Kofi.
Thank you both for the presentations. I hope that, I have several questions. I will limit myself to one for now, but I hope we can continue the conversation offline, because I found them both equally fascinating in different ways. My first question is for Nicky, and wanting to get a sense of whether you feel that what seems to be the scale of the project, or maybe the goals for the scale of the project, if you feel like that might in some way work against the values and spirit that guide the project, right? So there's a potential for a bunch of different communities that could be formed. Like the Latinx community is not a homogeneous community in and of itself. There are many kind of different stakeholders. Just to comment on that and questions about that.
Right. So I definitely had that concern, and there is that concern with, so many people having a say that actually nothing sort of ends up happening. And so that's why when I was trying to draw this up, I really tried to scope it to it's high school, it's college, and it's those teachers and their students. It's not, what I'm not saying this for, those can be picked up by people in public libraries, by people who want to use them for themselves. Absolutely, translated all the rest. But I'm trying to sort of keep that core audience small so that people do feel buy-in and do feel included and represented. Does that make sense?
So just a reminder, we're going to go
Sorry.
to the next.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you for these wonderful presentations. My question is for Nicky. Yeah, I don't want to sound overly, how do you say it? Cliche, but yeah, meta-literacy is very, very important. As I work with farmers, and those are not, they are not literate before they become digitally, quote-unquote, literate. But I realize that you are working in an environment where people are literate before they become digital literate, and then you come and do your meta-literacy project. So my question, which is also a reflection, is, have you been thinking about, in your community, people who are not, like, quote-unquote, literate, how your project can accommodate them, and how you can also have them work towards a certain meta-literacy. I'm interested in that because, like, deepfake are everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you are literate or illiterate, but it's just everywhere. And having insight from you, from your particular project, can also help look more into what I'm also doing here on in the continent. Thank you.
Should I answer, Lauren, or wait for another question? Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I am very aware that this project as it stands is already targeting a sort of information privileged set of users, and even the fact that people are in high school, right, is in itself suggesting hopefully a kind of literacy at a certain level. What I can say, and it's a small grant, it's a small project. What we are doing is ensuring that we're going to make the platform open source. We're going to document everything really well so that if people want to replicate it, not have to go through the work of sort of redoing the platform and the tagging system and everything else, that they can actually take it and replicate it themselves. So it's sort of open not only in the content, but really in, I think, the documentation and the code. So my hope is that maybe we partner on a future grant. Yeah. That one was for me.
Yeah, it was an interesting comment about know your customer regulations. I don't know too much about the crypto world, so I'll have to look into that. But I basically agree with the sentiment of kind of understanding local norms and laws and seeing how they fit within that. Thanks for that.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation, Nicky. Your work sounds really wonderful. And I am interested to know, you could have different approach to this, right? Like, so you can compile this from a post-capitalist point of view, or AI Commons, so what are you, because openness from a Maori point of view and openness from a Google point of view would get you to very different stage, and I feel like that's such a big responsibility to sort of anchor, and I can see your work as well being adopted by many other libraries across the world. So we have this issue, for instance, with digital security trainings. You develop a tool, and then you find the tool has been adopted in Mandarin, and you're like, but no, you shouldn't use that because this is not developed in your context, So what are so the framing, what are you thinking of in terms of that? And then adoption, what are the sort of the cautions that you would put out there?
answer or wait? Okay.
How many questions are we allowed to ask? Just one? Okay. Okay, I just have a question for Will then, since I'll just ask Nicky in person. So I'm just wondering, how do you actually measure quality, especially when, for instance, you're creating a language that's something that you're not familiar with. For instance, you're creating Indonesian, and all the crawlers, are native English speakers, or are probably not aware of the context in Indonesia. And I'm just really curious, sorry, it's a sneaky second sub-question. And how do you actually measure website ranking? And can it be manipulated to, for instance, in particular countries, putting it to the context of Indonesia or maybe the Philippines, where some parties, even though a website is really well-intentioned, has really good quality, but some people have, potentially troll armies who could potentially manipulate the look of a particular or the quality of a particular source. So to what extent does web crawling account for these nuances, but also for ways in which external forces could actually impact the perceived quality or even correctness of a particular source?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, John. Yeah, so quality, like you're right? How do you measure quality for a language you don't speak? How do you actually, and similarly, how do you measure quality for, every site of these, 300 terabytes that you're absolutely never going to read? The answer is that, you use automated methods, right? You use things as proxies for actually going in and reading the sites. And I think that's a major challenge actually moving forward. So what they do is they use the, of all the URLs that they've collected, they use the amount of URLs that are kind of pointing towards a single site as an indication that that site is of a high quality. And so they use a similar system in Google as well to kind of like, as something is like a valid, representative source basically. Yeah, and so how can, this kind of structure be used potentially adversarially? I think it's a great question. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that, one thing that does happen with this crawler is by having, you can kind of trick it into going into these bubbles, right? So it means that if it operates by, the certain amount of links that are linked to it by certain sites, you can kind of fake quality in that sense, right? You can have like lots of sites kind of pointing towards this one site that kind of elevates its notion of quality, when in actual fact the substance of the content is, potentially, awful in any number of dimensions. So yeah, I think that can definitely be like co-opted for sure. Yeah.
Just basically the number. So for instance, the same with academic articles. Just because many cite it doesn't mean that it's correct or that people agree with it.
Totally, yeah. It's not. It's a little bit more complex than just a number, but yeah, pretty much that's the gist.
Actually, just something I'd been thinking about a lot while Will was talking was this sort of quality ranking, decision making based on qualities and ranks reminds me of how we assess institutions and researchers, right? And how that reinforces hegemonic power and dynamics, those kinds of dynamics as well. Okay, so to your question, okay, that's really difficult. We're approaching this project obviously from the sense of like these 5 R's, trying to really maximize the potential for reuse and adoption, so that if there's a certain object that someone's like, I would like to use that, but these examples aren't going to speak to my students. I need to change names. I need to that is totally doable and fine. That kind of licensing, which it would be like CC BY in the Creative Commons sense, right, means that someone like Pearson could come along and take all of these materials and put them into a book and sell them as an online resource, right? That's something you kind of have to accept. You could do a CC BY NC, which is a non-commercial license. Those tend to not hold up in court, and like who am I to take Pearson to court? Like, it's not going to happen. So when it comes to kind of the differential access that you were talking about in terms of maybe indigenous communities and what they have available, I think this is not about access to the data itself, but rather the artifacts that they might have made publicly available to share. I would love to do a project like this that had various degrees of access but it would involve technically and I think socially a lot of buy-in from the contributors and from the programmers to build a system that would allow for all of those different types of access and for requests and, I have not yet met an academic who wants their work to have to answer a question every time someone wants to use their work and say, yes, you can use it, yes for this, no for that, right? People sort of want to move on to the next project and get it done. So for this one, we're going for all out open. And obviously with on the sort of level of the individual objects, if the people that have created those want them to be otherwise licensed, they probably wouldn't be included in this, but we could think about ways to suggest additional resources or links or some sort of way to point out to those materials and sort of lift them up while saying that they are not openly available. I think in terms of the framing, I just have to be really clear about, what this is, who it's for, the intended audience, and the sort of context within which it was built. So if people do want to take it and do other things with it, they sort of are going to be aware that it may not work for their systems or their communities or their populations. But by licensing in a way that it can be remixed, they can take whatever works for them and leave the rest. Does that make sense?
Michael, do you want to go to some online questions, and I'll collect some more questions from the room while you do that?
Sure. So people online, if you have questions, or you certainly put up your hand, or if you feel more comfortable, signal to me in the chat that I can read off your question.
Okay, well, we have a question in the room. Have you got
Okay,
one?
we also have one online as well.
Okay, so let's take that one first.
Eleni? Hey.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I've been silent in the background for the past week, and it's been wonderful. I have a comment/question, and I have to say that part of when Michael was asking his question, some of it I cut out. My internet wasn't very good, so I hope you didn't ask the same question since we come from the same institution. You might have the same anxiety as me. I want to ask a question that gets us back to design, quite literally to design of spaces we haven't really talked about very much, of physical spaces, and libraries are really transforming as physical spaces. So I'm wondering if Nicky has had any thoughts about what that trend is and how it might intersect with what she's doing. It may seem like a far out there question because really all the kind of literacy you're talking about may not even necessarily need to bring people together in the same room to happen, because so much of it can happen through digital media and instruction, remote instruction and whatever. But our library is basically emptying out of books, becoming much more of a space that's been redesigned as bringing people together. Students are certainly in it, but I don't see it. It's becoming more of a social space. I'm not sure what kind of educational things are happening within the library that much, except for being a quiet place for people to work in. So this whole transformation of the physical space in relation to the kind of literacy you're talking about and the changing role of librarians, which I think is totally critical and I'm totally in support of, is what I'm wondering if you have any comments on. Thank you.
Sure. So there's a lot that's sort of being said right now about libraries as third spaces, right? And I think their ability on campuses which can be incredibly siloed to be one of the only places on campus where students from different departments or schools, particularly when we're talking actually about things like computer science, where and at my institution at Carnegie Mellon, right, where like they are so deep in their work that they really don't have a chance to engage with students across the campus. And so the library is really seen as, and also I think working on becoming more this sort of space for communities of practice and educational communities of practice to meet and engage and to meet around areas of concern. We have a sustainability initiative, for example, in the library that brings in people from across different departments and schools that are interested in the topic. And I think we already are doing a lot of those sort of hackathons, workshops, like anything that can sort of bring people together, mostly in person, but some online. How it intersects with this project? I mean, I guess that the core of both is a sense of community, right? And that sense of, like a library is no discipline, and I feel like meta literacies should also not be any discipline. They are sort of the, and that's why I'm saying that while this is sort of housed in libraries and librarianship, my hope is really that the topic editors, the keyword editors and curators and the examples themselves come from all sorts of places, right? And it's sort of more that because libraries don't tend to want to, don't need to own the things as much as, well, unless you're sort of an Ivy League library and then you need to own all the fancy old books, but we certainly don't need to do that. Then I think you really have an ability to sort of provide the space for the things, if that makes sense. That wasn't very eloquent, I'm sorry, but thank you.
Hi.
Lauren, do we want to go to offline now?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you both for the amazing and interesting presentations. I have a question for Will, and I am going to paraphrase you, but I like the line you talk about when you talked about like determining what is data quality and who gets to define it, and something in your presentation about the distinction between the notion of web scraping and web crawling. And I'm in my head, and I don't want to ask you to talk about common crawl in particular, but this act of taking, stealing, the unauthorized appropriation of like information about people, and how that marries together with the terms crawling and scraping, or is there a certain kind of thing that can distinguish those terms? And I know that you were saying something like web crawling isn't always bad, it's when it's co-opted. But I just feel like the terms web crawling and the terms scraping, even though there's a distinction, seems to be really like sanitized terms for the act. And it seems like they're kind of tech speak. And I just feel like they don't reflect the gravity of the situation. And even if the people that are doing the crawling and the scraping aren't responsible for the co-option of what they've taken, they're still enabling it. And I feel like that's still, those still are really poor terms. So genuinely and curious to know what your thoughts are on those terms, whether they're sufficient or like how you can delineate what is at play.
There's a question from Matthew. Yeah, my question's also for you, Will. And I loved getting, being a fly on the wall of what's going on inside Common Crawl. And I wonder if you can expand a little bit about the attitudes of the engineers. And what I'm particularly interested in the extent to which like sort of data positivism and like a kind of sort of this kind of vision of AGI and one data set to rule them all is kind of operating behind the scenes. In some sense, a lot of the concerns that you have suggest that, you want different data sets for different research purposes. You know, like if you want to know what spam is like, you should have a data set of spam. If you want to know what, you know, what people are saying on the internet, you have to include the hate speech and the garbage. If you want to have, you know, sort of authoritative news sites, then you're narrowing it on something else. If you want to collect a data set on Indonesian, you should have a data set on Indonesian. Why is there one common crawl, right? What do they say about that?
Thank you both. They're both really great questions. Yeah, I guess to Noel first, I think that what this case kind of points me towards is just the insufficiencies, I think, of the existing standards that we have, right? I think that if you ask people at Common Crawl, they would say that actually we did ask for consent. We did ask for consent to take this data, and that's why it's not stealing, or in their eyes, it's actually just it's respecting the wishes of the people that own the content to be included in this crawl. I think that the problem here is that we're relying on a standard that was developed in, what was it, 94, I think, with very different. Ooh. Blown a generator. We're just too hot. Yeah, that's it. Can't handle this. What's that? Okay. Yeah, so I guess what I was saying, yeah, so from the eyes of Common Crawl, it's not stealing or it's not appropriation, it's because it's actually respecting the wishes of the people that own the content. I think that, yeah, the insufficiency here is that we have a standard that was developed in a time before any of this that doesn't really understand the context that it's being applied in. And so what we really need is a new standardized approach for asking for consent of like, do you want to be collected in this crawl? One of the major things that the people at Common Crawl were talking to me about is that, I think that a lot of people actually do want to be included in this, right? Because it becomes the starting point of, for instance, all the models downstream, you kind of might want your information, your data, your name or whatever to be included in that crawl, so it does kind of reach into those models if it gets there, right? So allowing that specific and yeah, I guess, intentional consent, I think, is a really important process moving forward.
I have a follow-up to that, actually, for you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering a lot about consent as a sort of ongoing process, right? So it's not, and so a robots.txt file is sort of consent, whatever, like you said, like 20 years ago or whatever, right. And then, and I'm trying to imagine a system that would allow for a sort of ongoing differential type of consent that would still be scalable enough for the kinds of work that's being done here.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's something that, they don't have the answer for yet as well. As I kind of mentioned, right, so they check this robots.txt at the moment that they collect the data, but really you should be checking it, at the moment that you use the data, and then kind of continually, like whether people actually want you to be using that data in the first place. So that doesn't happen, and secondly, like it's, as I mentioned, it's technically very challenging to repeal data once it's been collected in the first place. So I think rethinking, the data formats that we have to kind of allow for, retractable consent is going to be really important. And yeah, kind of like a more, opt-in, like positive version of consent as well. To Matthew's question, yeah, great question as well. I think that it definitely, it does give me that vibe, potentially, this like one data set to rule them all. I think that the idea that Common Crawl kind of comes in with is that we will give you everything, and then it's your job to take the bits that you want, right? But it's just like a single crawl to kind of like do that. Yeah, I'm definitely, in your camp. It's like, I think that if we have very specific, very like localized, small scale data sets that are maybe more intended for use, that we might have more equitable, better outcomes here. But yeah, that'll be interesting.
Michael, do you have some questions? I've been told that there may be some questions in the chat.
I do see comments in the chat. I haven't. I was hoping that people who wanted to. It's not clear to me that whether some of the comments were expressed with the intention of being raised during the panel or not.
Right. So perhaps
So I don't want to read off those comments without people's consent. But if people would signal those. We do have, people are okay, great. All right, I see. Right, so yes, we do have a couple questions. All right, let's just get to that. Excuse me, folks, while I locate them.
I can ask a question.
Okay, so one question that we have from, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing the name, Ushnish, has a question, I believe for Nicky, saying that I have used OER Commons, but I find a lot of resources are not actually available for open modification. Are there better collections of OER content, or is the gap that you're, or is this the gap you were trying to fill? And then for Will, also, what are some of the ways that we can as a civil society organizations and researchers determine the types of qualitative features and quantitative metrics that are of interest, i.e. when the AI vendors are not transparent? So that's a question for each of you from Ushnis.
So thanks for that question about OER Commons. It can be an issue, right? Whenever people make the materials and they make them openly available, but they license them. There's a Creative Commons license that you can use that says you cannot change this in any way, right? And that it's helpful for the creator who doesn't necessarily want to have their work taken out of context, right? That can always be an issue. But it's not so helpful for the person who wants to use the materials. I found the Creative Commons website itself has a lot of information, and you can search by license. So if you're actually looking for things that are expressly available for remixing, you can go there. There's also a site called Merlot, and another site which is more about open textbooks called OpenStax. I think that's out of Rice University. There is also the ability to search Google by license, but it's not that great.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So if I understand, it's about how we can determine the quantitative and qualitative metrics to actually determine quality. I think that this last week has really provided some amazing frameworks about how, certain very localized specific ways that we can do that. I think that one thing that I would really advocate for is no single monolithic or whole standard that that data quality kind of applies for, but really it's about very specific and intended use cases determined by the community itself. So this draws me back to presentations such as Eleonora that was looking at processes, democratic processes that are kind of localized as well. Similarly with Lara, thinking about how these how these kind of machines might enact harm and what an alternative kind of might be as well. I think these kinds of processes that are very much driven by participation is going to be an important step moving forward.
So we have a question from Funmi.
Thank you so much, both of you, for very informative presentations. I think Will's talk somewhat has provided the missing link that I have been trying to get at when it comes to data stuff. But I'm still trying to wrap my head around the technical thing. So I don't think my questions might be legible, so I'll save them for later. So I don't embarrass myself with technological nonsense. Yeah, but then, so my question now is for Nicky. I was thinking about the keywords part. I've been stuck on it. And this is more or less a clarification. The idea of having topic editors will then provide the keywords. Are they just going to provide the books, like the resource, or are they also going to provide the keywords? Because I was thinking, why not get the keywords from the people themselves, as opposed to getting keywords from people who just sit around and are living in particular bubbles. And that comes from the fact that, like what someone said online said, the library is being reconfigured, not just as a thought space, but as much as it is sold by political propagandists that, oh, this is where kids are, go to get sullied and spoiled. Even the kids themselves don't seem to enjoy the library anymore because of all of this back and forth in it. And when they do go to the library, it's for fun stuff. And I'm imagining, even if they are interested in political stuff, they were interested in literacy, in their ed space, I can imagine that they are more interested in like fun stuff. Like if I go to the library, for instance, I and my friend, we are organizing a fine arts exhibition at the Tuscaloosa Public Library, which is the local library at my place. So, and everyone is interested because it's manga, anime, just like all these things that may not necessarily have to do with like big political issues. So I was wondering if that's something you're also incorporating into this topic keywords thing that you are doing. And lastly, what is the intent to collaborate with non-library folks in order to get these high school kids and even the teachers interested in the website, in the project itself, if that makes sense?
Sorry, what was the last bit? How will I?
Non-library folks,
Yeah.
like you are talking about moving out of the bubble. So I think collaborating with non-library folks might do that, but I don't want to assume that you are not, and so I'm asking it as a question.
Sure. Okay, I'll go from the.
So this will be the last question, I think.
Okay.
Unless, Kate, you have one? Oh, okay. So I think we have time for 3. So I'm going to ask a question.
Can I answer Fumi's first because it was 3 parts and I just will forget?
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so the first part was about non-library folks. Yeah, so we have a center, it's called the Center for Shared Prosperity on campus that works very closely with a lot of the public high schools. And then we also have a couple of people who have been coordinating sort of the ways in which we work with high schools. We do a lot of pre-college sort of workshops and things like that. So I am sort of have been tapping into that community as a kind of test bed locally in Pittsburgh for how to move out and how to sort of have those people involved in the creation of materials who can then reach out to their networks about, you know, what's available. You asked about manga and things like that. I would absolutely... I would love if people submitted fun stuff as open educational resources. 100%. Yes. My idea of an open educational resource is anything you can teach with, right? The fact that this is an online thing probably means that there has to be an online element to it. But yes. We create a lot of zines in our library. I would love to, you know, like all of that kind of thing. Yes. And then your question about the keywords. So I love this question. The reason it's set up the way it is right now is because sort of in order to have a call for people to curate certain keywords, kind of figured we'd need to sort of say what those keywords were. But we could also, you're making me think here, just have a call to say, we are doing this thing on AI literacy. And it's a call for keywords. Please propose your keyword and, you know, say why you're qualified to do it. And that might actually be a much better way to do it. So thank you for that.
Okay, so I hope this will be a quick follow-up to Noelle's question about crawl and scrape. I just want to throw in that whether or not we like the term, some people have invoked the idea of there having been a social contract implicit and sometimes explicit for those who were using the internet and wanted to be seen. And that was true whether they had a website, like Critical AI's website, say, where we want people to find us, or something commercial. We wanted to sell people stuff. And that the social contract, when, whether we like that term or not, when search engines first came into being, was that you would make yourself legible to Google, which was an advantage to them as they were quickly becoming the dominant site. And you would sort of render a lot of metadata transparent to them. You would allow yourself to be crawled precisely because they wanted to help you be visible. And among other things, what quote unquote AI has done is to break that contract, because Google itself, as well as ChatGPT and many others, are now using those very websites in order to synthesize data, sometimes fairly close to verbatim, without showing you the site, or in some instances showing you some, providing some links as an afterthought. And so I wonder whether a keyword of some kind is necessary to make this palpable and for there to be guidelines, and whether there are people in Common Crawl who are aware of what has happened here.
And I'll be brief because I know we're getting low on time. I was thinking about Michael's earlier comments about epistemology, and Will, you evoked Anne-Marie Moll's work, which takes a slightly different perspective on that. And I guess I wanted to ask a question. I'm asking it to you, Will, because you've evoked her, and I think we could all use her work to think a little bit more critically. And Kath has been texting me about how much we both love Anne-Marie Moll. But I do wonder, so she doesn't just talk about multiplicity of objects, right? She talks about the multiplicity that's inherent to what we think become objects. And so it's a slightly different approach. And so I just wanted to ask you how you're thinking with her work in this, because just thinking through it off the top of my head, and again, this is not cooked, her work could actually disrupt what we think data is, not just quality. And then that would have spillover effects for the type of system you're talking about in terms of crawling and what Common Crawl does, or what it is and what it's co-producing. So I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you're thinking with Moll's work in the project, and then maybe we can later on in our other conversations start thinking through that as well.
Yeah, I would love to chat later about this as well. I guess what I love about Anne-Marie Moll's work is kind of starting with practice, right? Starting with that as kind of like the intervention. And so she has this wonderful quote. It's like, I want to take this, it's something like, I want to take this opportunity as a means to understand their own standards, not as an opportunity to apply my own, right? And so I was really kind of approaching this work through that lens, thinking about the practices through which these engineers kind of come to detect what quality is, and whether that's like, say, online in forums, whether that's through like links, whether that's through like technical breakdown as well. But so kind of following those indicators of where quality kind of emerges. I think you're right. I think I need to maybe continue to rethink or think through the implications of ontology, right? Which is essentially where she gets to about like what this means for the thing itself. I'm not really sure where I'm at yet on that, but yeah, I'd love to chat later about that. Let's do it. Lauren, to your point, yeah, I think that like maybe a new term would be generative here. Thinking about the Common Crawl folk, I really have to give them credit, because they really are aware, and they're making an effort to put themselves in these conversations, to kind of understand these perspectives from the people that are at those conversations that are actually at risk of them. So I really think that that's a really important first step. I think I called it, a consent creep in my talk about like how these consent protocols are kind of being repurposed. I prefer yours in terms of like a literal breaking of a social contract. And I think that's a really generative frame to kind of rethink this moment of consent as well. Thank you.
Great. Lauren, are we out of time?
2 minutes, apparently. 2 minutes.
All right, 2 minutes.
We don't need to fill them.
In that case, maybe I should just say thanks to Will and Nicky. Join me in thanking them for this excellent presentation.
And can we also thank Michael?
Yes, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.